All right, great. Well, let's dive into Category 5, Board Governance. This is a very broad topic in some ways, but also very narrow. So we're going to be really talking about each specific organizational standard and what the content is in our technical assistance guide. So as I mentioned, the purpose of today's webinar really is to do an overview of the new TA guide that has been developed. It will be posted shortly up on our website. It's just in the design phase at this point. So today we're going to give you an overview of the guide. We're going to talk about how you use the guide both from an agency side as well as from the state side. We're going to do a discussion of each of the organizational standards, and again, we're going to take some of your questions as we go through here today. So the purpose of the TA guide, we've done a lot of different webinars, trainings, and specifically for boards, I hope that you know that we've done a series of very short videos on each of the 9 categories of the organizational standards for boards. Today's webinar and the TA guide is really focused on how do you assess against those critical standards in Category 5 specifically. So we're not going to dive into all the standards that impact boards. We're going to hit really those standards here in Category 5. So the purpose of the TA guide is really to be responsive to what the network has been asking for. What's the intent of the standard? What's the definition of the standard? How do we assess whether or not we meet or don't meet the standards? How do we document whether or not we met the standard? And the TA guide takes that initial assessment tool that we developed several months ago that's up on our website that has some initial guidance and places for you to check, did you meet or not meet the standards? This guide kind of takes that and expands a bit further. It dives into what is considered the definition and the intent of the standard a little bit more thoroughly. It dives into more of what the intention was, the interpretation and the documentation opportunities that you'll have to meet the standard. And as you know, I'm sure in many of these standards there's no one right way to document. There might be a variety of ways for you to document meeting the standard. The guide is just to give you some ideas and some suggestions about potential ways to document that you've met the standard. Now, we're also called here at the partnership through our organizational standards grant through OCS to go beyond compliance with the standard. So an element of the TA guide is to help provide suggestions on how agencies can go from compliance toward organizational excellence. And so when you look at Section C of the guides, please keep in mind those are for agency self-assessment only. They're meant to help perhaps provide a roadmap to how to improve performance in each of the standards areas. It's not meant to be a guide to say you have to do these things. They're meant for technical assistance and growth for the organization. And in Section D of the guide, in each of the 9 standards in Category 5, we provide you a list of resources that we specifically target and think would be beneficial to readers of the toolkit. So when you are looking at the review process for Category 5, some things to keep in mind. And as I mentioned, just because there are 9 standards here in Category 5 doesn't mean those are the only standards boards need to be paying attention to. Please refer back to that board video series that I talked about a little bit earlier for a deeper dive into those broader areas, but there are a number of standards that impact board governance. When you're doing your assessment, you're probably not going to just do governance and you're just going to do finance and you're just going to do data analysis. Odds are you're probably looking at the whole package of organizational standards. And again, we think that's a wise decision because not everything just fits into a box, right? So you're going to be looking comprehensively at your organization. We ask that you think about a team of folks who are going to help in your agency assess. Now, when it comes to board governance, you might want to consider a board member or a board committee providing some oversight to that process because a lot of times governance standards do apply to how the board is operating, how it's constructed, and some of the tasks it needs to do. But again, there's no requirement or one right way to do that. But consider a team of folks to help assess the organization against the standards. Make sure everyone who's doing that internal assessment at your agency knows what it means to meet and not meet a standard. Make sure that everyone kind of knows what that line is and what kind of documentation you're going to want to have in place to make sure that you can show that you've met the standard. You're going to want to set up a process for possibly managing the recommendations that come out of the process. Perhaps the state office may be providing you some feedback. Perhaps you'll be doing a peer-to-peer review that may provide suggestions. You might have a consultant coming in to assist. So there might be a series of recommendations that, again, take you beyond compliance toward excellence. And again, you might want to be thinking about a uniform process to making sure that you're archiving the documentation that you collect to show that you meet the standards. If you're using board minutes, for instance, you may want to create a file folder, you might want to create a binder, you might want to create a system up on a web sharing cloud-based system to keep your documents straight as well. So we're going to be showing you again a little bit later about opportunities to go beyond compliance. We're going to be showing you some we're going to show you some tables that get into strengths and opportunities for improvement. You may want to think about reviewing materials and other examples of resources out there that can help an agency figure out what can it mean for an agency to go beyond compliance. Consider more frequent review of some of the information. And again, the tripartite board continues to be a critical issue for board governance, and when we look at about going beyond compliance, we oftentimes think about how do we take our tripartite structure to the committee level as well. Go to the next slide. All right, so I know in a lot of the videos that we've been talking about the different types of standards, and in this toolkit that is no different. When I do a lot of training on board governance, I do like to frame board duties around the duty of the fiduciary, that the board has a role to put the interest of the corporation, especially a fiduciary financially, but also programmatically and otherwise, ahead of an individual board member's own best interest. And when you look at the organizational standards, I think they really fall into the three sub-duties that it comes with board governance: the duty of care, the duty of loyalty, and the duty of obedience. And you'll see in the toolkit that we do just line up the duties in these different areas, and we flesh out again, what does it mean to be a fiduciary for the organization? What does it mean to avoid conflicts of interest when you're looking at the duty of loyalty to the organization? When we get into bylaws, how do we make sure when we tie the duty of obedience to making sure the board members have copies of bylaws, they're familiar with the bylaws, they understand what's in the bylaws? And again, when we get to the duty of care, it's things like making sure the boards are paying attention, making sure that they're getting financial reports, programmatic reports at every board meeting to make sure that, again, board members are really paying attention, which again is that duty of care kind of foundational element. As I mentioned, there are a lot of different standards areas that impact board governance. Certainly the community assessment, financial leadership, strategic planning, human resources, data and analysis, all of those different categories have standards within them that impact boards. So there may be things coming to the board for approval. The board may need to be paying certain attention to strategic planning that they haven't been in the past. So there are some other areas where board members need to be paying attention. And I'll just do a plug now, and I may do so later, that we have a variety of webinars here at the partnership to help you, both as staff and as board members, do a deeper dive into a number of different categories, whether they're organizational standards or not. Even just in the next 2 weeks here at the partnership, we're doing a session on ethics, which certainly is a good foundational element for boards and executive leadership. We're going to be doing a piece on whistleblower policies. And as you perhaps know, that in one of the standards we do talk about whistleblower policies. And when it comes to board governance, we're doing a webinar in 2 weeks specifically on conflicts of interest. Now that webinar will be recorded up on our website, so if you're watching this webinar later, not the live version, you can certainly go up on our website and hopefully download that recorded webinar that will be done on September 21st. So there are a number of resources, and in the toolkit itself, we want to make sure that when you're looking at Category 5, there are some elements that you really pay attention to. You'll see here that we have CAPLAW's Toolkit for Top-Notch CAAs. Here's a hard copy of it. We do have several here at the partnership, but this is downloadable off of CAPLAW's website. I often promote it as one of the critical resources. Now you're saying, that's an awfully thick resource, I'm not going to spend the time to read it. What's really nice about this toolkit is that there's text to about here, and then there are appendices, samples, documents that you can borrow. I think it is a fabulous resource, and I encourage you, if you have not seen this resource, to download it off CAPLAW's website. They also have the Bylaws Toolkit. Now there's a small fee for that product, but it is an excellent product in terms of clauses for you to consider, elements of committee structure and things like that to be thinking about as you construct your bylaws. Excuse me. There's also the Legal Practices and Policies Guidebook. And also, we also reference a lot IM 82, IM 82 is the IM specific to board governance. And if you as board members have not read IM 82 recently, I encourage you to do so. Now, in the toolkit itself, we also talk about the importance of board minutes. And I know that the toolkit for top-notch CAs talks about board minutes and what goes into good board minutes, so I encourage you to connect those pieces as well. The toolkit also talks about the role of a nominations or a governance or a board development committee. Again, I think when you look at some of the organizational standards and how you document that you meet them, having a good board governance committee is critical. We also talk about in the toolkit the role of the executive director, working with the board to help document that the board is meeting the organizational standards. And that relationship between board ED is really critical. So we encourage you to make sure you take a look at some of these resources that talk about those elements. Now, the other toolkit from CAP Law that talks about the legal, if you go back just one, sorry, the exemplary legal practices, it has 10 action steps to compliance and ethical practices. I think, again, that resource really helps talk about setting the tone at the top. And that's what the governance standards are a lot about, is really how do we set the tone at the top, that we're going to avoid conflicts of interest, that we're going to perform at a high level, that we're going to embody the CSBG Act or our tripartite structure. So again, I encourage you to take a look at CAP Law's toolkit. Now, our own toolkit has some limitations. It is trying to be a concise document, trying to be easy to read, trying not to be this hefty document that certainly is a great resource. But we know folks really want to know around standards specifically, what are those critical elements that we need to know. All right, so I'm going to pause here. Are there any questions so far, Cashin, through the question and answer window?
Not as of yet, but you can put those into the right-hand column into the Q&A box at any point.
Great. All right, so let's start going through the organizational standards. Now, we're going to go through each of the standards, and we're going to refer back to the TA guide about what's in Section A and in Section B. So again, Standard 5.1 is no surprise to anyone. This is the elements that really embodies the CSBG Act, that our board needs to be structured in compliance with the Act, that at least 1/3 of the board needs to be democratically selected representatives of the low-income community, that 1/3 are elected officials or their representatives, and 3, that the remaining membership comes from major groups and interests in the community. Now, if you look at the TA guide, we certainly talk about the intent of the standard and the definition of the standard, but of all the standards, this is the one that's probably most familiar to the CSBG network. The tripartite board, of course, is not new to the network. It was included in the standards to help reflect the nuance and unique nature of community action and the community services block grant, and that maximum feasible participation of all sectors of the community. Again, not just the low-income sector, which I know we've oftentimes focused on, which is critically important, but we also have the elected officials sector, which certainly as someone who votes and elects our elected officials, it's important to have our representatives be a part of the fight on poverty. So that elected officials piece, the low-income sector, and then the representative sector from the private sector is also critically important. Now, when we look at compliance and documentation, many of you have had to compile documentation like this in the past. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so you may find the critical elements in your bylaws, your board membership list, perhaps your board minutes. Your board numbers in any one category may fluctuate at times given board turnover. And it's important to note, I think, in this is that when you're filling seats for board turnover, you do so in a thoughtful way. We're going to talk about this a little bit later. Did I get some of my slides?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. So when you're filling your seats in an appropriate manner, I think it's important to make sure that you're thoughtful. You're not just filling chairs with warm bodies. And I know we get very sensitive about filling seats when they're empty, which I know we need to do, and we need to do so in a thoughtful, reasonable time frame. We just want to make sure that when we fill those tripartite seats, we're not just looking for a warm body. We're looking for somebody who is committed to our organization, invested, and is willing to move forward as a good board member. So let's move to Standard 5.2. So here the organization's governing board has written procedures that document a democratic selection process for low-income board members adequate to assure they are representative of the low-income community. Now again, this standard is not new. When we first developed the organizational standards and they were submitted to OCS a while back, this standard, we got a lot of questions. Is this new Where did this come from? Now, the democratically selected piece has been in the CSBG Act, and please note that it does say democratically selected. So once a board member has been selected from a low-income community, neighborhood association, perhaps from the Policy Council, Head Start Policy Council, they still need to be elected to the board following your procedures outlined in your bylaws. So again, no one can tell a board necessarily, depending on how their bylaws are structured, who's going to be sitting at the table. But for most organizations, if there is an individual selected to sit on the board, it's very likely they're going to be seated by the board, but it's important to still go through your process of electing that board member to that board seat. And we do reference IM 82 here and in the guide that, remember, the implicit intent of this requirement is to ensure that those who currently live in areas served by the Community Action Agency are represented so they have a strong voice in agency governance and direction and are able to convey to those that represent the presence and significance of community action in their lives. So again, there are a lot of caveats in that low-income sector, but I do like to refer back to IM 82 and the overall intent of that standard. And finally, to compliance and documentation. And again, this should not be new to folks. You've been having to document your compliance with the tripartite structure for state reviews for a long time. This can be in your written policy itself. It could be in procedure manual, for instance. It could be in your bylaws, perhaps reflected in your minutes. There are a lot of different ways to do this. Now, we do get asked a lot about examples. So we did take examples both from the top-notch toolkit as well as when we've been in the field with other organizations. And these are not required, but we know we get a lot of requests for examples of a democratic selection process. So here are a few. Election by ballot, cast by CAP agency clients and or other low-income folks in a community action agency service area, a vote at a community meeting, getting a petition signed by a certain number of folks living in a low-income community, or designation of community organizations composed predominantly of and representative of low-income people, such as the Head Start Policy Council, a low-income housing tenant association. But again, remember to make sure it's someone from that organization who is really embodying that low-income community. Pause here to see if any questions have come in through the chat window.
Not as of yet.
All right. Standard 5.3, the agency's bylaws have been reviewed by an attorney within the past 5 years. Now, we know that for many of you, this has been one of the challenging organizational standards. And that's pretty much because you'll have bylaws. Perhaps they've been reviewed by a board committee, by staff recently, but perhaps not by an attorney. So if you're looking, the toolkit does talk a lot about the importance of bylaws. Now, bylaws are critical governance documents, certainly, and board members are not expected to be experts on nonprofit law. So while bylaws really are your legal rules of the road, and it's critical that the board has the legal advice behind it to know that its rules are in compliance with both federal and state law. Now, it can be critical to note that there's nothing in the standards that talks about what kind of attorney you have to do that review. Certainly, we have thoughts and recommendations that are in the guide that talk about it may be thought, you may want to be given thought to, is the lawyer familiar with your not-for-profit corporation law in your state? Are they familiar with the CSBG Act? Are they familiar with other organizations like yours in your community? But again, there is no one requirement in the standard. So how do you document that you've met this review standard? Perhaps a copy of the invoice that your lawyer provided to you that says we charged you X for the review. Now, you don't have to pay money, right? You can try to get an in-kind or pro bono review, but if you have an invoice or even an invoice that said pro bono, that should suffice to show that you have had your legal review. A letter from the attorney saying, we have done the review, or perhaps a copy of the review itself. But we do note here, and we do note in the guide, that review of the bylaws is the agency's purview. And so when you're showing documentation to the state that you've met the organizational standard, you don't necessarily have to share a copy of the results of your review. Some other documentation should suffice because, again, that review is client-attorney privilege, and the content of that review is yours as a local organization. And as a state reviewer, if I was a state reviewer, I'd want to see some other documentation, whether, again, an invoice, a letter, something saying that this review happened. The final piece here is that a board minutes that the board minutes could reflect that the board talked about the review being done and that the board accepted the review, or some other documentation in the minutes that that review took place. Now, we do get a lot of FAQs, frequently asked questions on this one, and we include a lot of this in the guide. Here are some of the samples. Can we use an attorney who sits on our board to do the review? Again, there's nothing in the standards to prohibit this. However, you may find that your attorneys that sit on your board may not be willing to review formally your agency's bylaws, but there are a lot of ways that the board member can assist your organization in their capacity as a board member. Perhaps they can conduct the initial review of the bylaws and prepare the bylaws for a more expedited review by an outside attorney. They could share a committee task to do the review. They can provide connections to other attorneys in their network who might be willing to do a discounted or pro bono review, or perhaps do a trade. Maybe you have a sister organization that has an attorney on their board, and perhaps your attorney could review their bylaws and vice versa as a contribution to your organization. Now, can you use a staff attorney? Again, staff attorneys play a little bit different role, right, sitting at your organization, so that might also be amenable to your organization to decide to do that if you have an attorney on staff. They could also do a number of those tasks noted above for a board member who is an attorney. Not sure I would have a staff attorney chair a committee of the board, but certainly a staff attorney could staff a board committee who's overseeing doing that bylaw review. Now, another question we oftentimes is that we're in a rural community, a very small community. There's very limited attorneys. How are we going to find an attorney? Now, in this day and age, certainly with the internet, conference calling capacity, things like that, there is no requirement that you have to use an attorney in your local community. I know many of you choose to do that, certainly because it's good for local relationships, things like that, and you may have someone locally, and that's great. But remember that you could potentially work with your state association, for instance, to find other attorneys in your state who might be willing to do a group purchase for CAP agencies for bylaws review, or some other arrangement that might be amenable to you. And is there a tool to help you get you started? Yes. I go back to that bylaw toolkit done by CAP Law. I really think it's an excellent resource. It maybe can help get your bylaws 99% of the way there or 90% of the way there, give you some really good ideas and some things to check in on and to take it from there. So I encourage you to take a look at that toolkit as well. Now, standard 5.4 is pretty straightforward, right? All this really says is that the organization documents that each governing board member has gotten a copy of the bylaws within the past 2 years. Again, that duty of care, that they're paying attention to the organization, the duty of loyalty that says board members have to be loyal to the organization, and then the duty of obedience that they have to obey the law, including agency bylaws. It's important that board members have the rules of their road in hand. And as we've talked about in previous webinars, oftentimes you'll get bylaws when you become a new board member, but those bylaws get misplaced, they get, thrown away, who knows where they might be. And oftentimes your nominations committee know exactly where they are because they have to look at them for seating the next tier of board members. But it's important that all board members have copies. So in every 2-year window to get a copy seems reasonable. Now, guidance on the definition and intent. Part of the intent, again, board decisions and board actions that are taking place that are not in compliance with what your bylaws say that process needs to be are really not valid. It can be called into question. You want to make sure your board is seated in a way that is compliant with your bylaws. You want to make sure that you know what your quorum is. You want to make sure that that quorum is in line with state law and other requirements. So it's important that, again, that legal review takes place. That board members get a copy of those bylaws. Now remember, the second one, the standard is limited to receipt of the bylaws only. There's no requirement to do a training on the bylaws or a walkthrough of the bylaws. It really is that board members just need to get a copy of the bylaws. Now the bylaws can be done in an electronic copy. They can be done in a hard copy, however you want to do that. Now, acknowledgement of that receipt of the bylaws can also be done in a couple of different ways. You could have a sign-in list that board members signed that they were at the meeting when bylaws were distributed. If we're going to do it electronically, perhaps board members send an email confirmation or you trigger an auto reply if it's read on your side. Perhaps there are board minutes that document who was in attendance and that you've distributed the bylaws at that meeting. So no one right way to do it. It is pretty straightforward. Hopefully that is not a burdensome standard for you to be meeting. I'll pause again to see if there are any questions that have come in. All right. You're a quiet group today, so please put questions in the box if you have them. So standard 5.5, the governing board meets in compliance with the frequency and quorum requirements and fills board vacancy as set out in its bylaws, right? You have your rules of the road in your bylaws. It's important for you as an organization to comply with that. So are you meeting with the frequency and quorum requirements, and are you filling vacancies? Now those are two different elements, right? Meeting frequency, actually three, meeting and frequency, making sure you have quorum, and making sure that you're filling your vacancies, all critical. So let's talk about the definition and intent of the standards. Again, boards need to comply with their bylaws. The number of board meetings might be noted and probably is noted in your bylaws. You might say it meets 6 times a year, it may meet 8 to 10 times a year. Some organizations say you might even meet monthly. Now, a board can meet more frequently than is spelled out in your bylaws, and your bylaws will say, how do you call a special meeting of the board, what's the process to make sure word gets out, especially if you have open meeting law. You really want to make sure you're paying attention to a lot of those rules and regulations about how you call special meetings. So a board can meet more times, it just can't meet less times. So it's important to know how many meetings a year your agency needs to have. Now, for a meeting to actually happen, you need to have a quorum, right? A quorum needs to be established for the meeting to occur and for board business to be conducted. Now, in many places, certainly quorum is usually, 51% or a majority of the board members that are seated at that time meets a quorum. Sometimes state law will allow a smaller quorum to be set. I think the minimum at any point in time would be 1/3. That would be minimally required. I think 51% is probably a better option for that, so you can make sure that decisions are not being voted on by a very small subsector of the board. That's why 51% at least makes a lot of sense. Now, you'll have certain decisions, right, that call for a supermajority of the board need to be in place or be in quorum, so you want to take a look at that as well. Now, how do you provide guidance on the compliance? How do you document that you met the standard? Again, board minutes would be a helpful place to do that. Your board roster and certainly your board bylaws would be another element of that. Standard 5.6. Here we get into the conflict of interest. And again, that duty of loyalty to the organization calls on board members to not have conflicts with the organization. Now, if you receive certain kinds of monies, right, if you have Head Start or if you have HUD funding, there are certain regulations around can you even have board members that have conflicts, certain kind of conflicts, financial conflicts, conflicts of independence. In other ways, if you don't have some of that funding, now sometimes conflicts may exist but can be managed carefully within an organization to make sure a board member fulfills their personal fiduciary duty. The board itself as a body fulfills its duty of making sure that it removes that conflict from the room when they're making decisions to make sure they're managing those conflicts appropriately. So you want to make sure you know what your rules of the road are in your particular state for your agency. So here, 5.6 that each board member will sign a conflict of interest policy, conflict of interest statement, at least once within the past 2 years. Now, you probably know that on your 990, your IRS tax form that you submit every year, it doesn't ask you whether or not board members have signed one that year. So annually is probably a better practice, but the standards here do say every 2 years. So again, as a fiduciary, a board member needs to put the interest of the corporation ahead of their own personal interests. Sometimes that's easier said than done, especially in a tripartite setting, where you have people who are representing particular neighborhoods, for instance, or particular constituencies, or they might be an elected official from a community. And so sometimes it can be hard to take off your individual rep hat and put on your board member hat to try to make sometimes those decisions. That's why if you have a conflict of interest, you need to make sure you note it for the board colleagues, and you make sure it's noted in the minutes that you've acknowledged a conflict. And I think it's good practice for board members to leave the room, perhaps even during discussions when a conflict is on the table. However, I digress. This standard is primarily around signing a conflict of interest form. So again, no one template is required. CAP law does have some examples of conflict of interest statements that I think are really good for community action agencies and CSBG eligible entities to take a look at. And again, they need to be signed by board members every 2 years. Now practically, everyone signs them. The ED or someone else at the board meeting probably collects those conflict of interest forms. Ideally, they're reviewed, but they're collected and then kept on file at the CAP agency. to make sure that you can show that all board members have signed that conflict of interest statement. Now again, I would review the toolkit for top-notch CAAs for examples. I would also see IM82. We note in the TA guide a number of elements from IM82 and conflicts of interest that I think is important for agencies to be familiar with. So 5.7, orientation. The organization has a process to provide structured orientation for governing board members within 6 months of being seated. So what's the intent of the standard? Good orientation is good practice for board members, right? Any job needs training, any job needs some level of orientation coming into it, and board service is a critical job, so good orientation is important. And as we know, CAP agencies are not simple organizations to understand. Most organizations are very complex. We tend to be very large nonprofits in our communities as well, but even if you're not a large nonprofit, your board members are still going to need to know what it means to be a tripartite board. IM82 calls on board members to be engaged in planning, evaluation, development in a lot of different ways than typical nonprofit boards are structured. So it's important that board members get good orientation. Even board members who've served on a number of nonprofit boards can find CAP agency board service a new challenge. So again, there is no specific curricula that you need to use for board member orientation. There are a lot of great examples out there. We provide in the TA guide some outlines of what might make a good orientation process for you to consider, the kinds of things to include. It's important to note that new board members need to be informed of the orientation and be encouraged to attend. We do note here and in the guide some of the caveats that we think it's important for CAP agencies and state monitors to keep in mind. That anything when it comes to volunteers, and that's why the verbiage in the standards are written the way it is, that you need to have a process for board orientation, is because it's tough to mandate volunteers attend things, right? So you can have a good structured orientation process. You have it's done the first Saturday in June, for instance, for 2 hours. You walk through a number of elements. You do, the board chair is there, the ED is there. It's offered to new board members to attend. They may choose or be unable to attend. So we do put in here that making sure that you note it is the process needs to be in place. It's going to be real tough to make sure that every board member gets to the orientation within 6 months. I'm not saying that to let agencies off the hook in any way, but I think that gets to reality of the situation, the reality of governance, the reality of volunteer management. So it's important to have the process, but if a board member chooses not to participate in that orientation, there's not much that the agency staff can do with that, but hopefully most of your board members will attend. They'll find it very valuable, and that it is more of an agency culture that, of course, you're going to attend that orientation process. Here we provide you some orientation suggestions. Again, the toolkit or the guide provides you more detail on some of this, but some things to keep in mind. Tour of the facility, review of the board handbook, meeting with the board chair and or ED. I think it's really good practice that the orientation includes someone other than just the executive director. I know that's often the case, that it is the ED sitting down with new board members, but I really think it's critically important that it includes perhaps the board chair, perhaps the board governance chair, the nominations committee chair as well, to make sure that it's peer-to-peer orientation. A good board handbook is something that I know CAP agencies do a real good job of, good information, background, bylaws, articles of incorporation, board members, committee lists, etc. I do like to note this last bullet here, past board minutes, perhaps 2 years worth, just so people can see what the discussions have been up to that period of time. Mentoring is a good practice. Again, nothing here is mandatory, but coming into a boardroom can be daunting and intimidating. Having a colleague who you've connected with perhaps as identified as your mentor, as your board buddy or board partner, to help ask all those kind of what you think are stupid questions, even though they're not stupid questions too, can be very helpful. Standard 5.8, similar to orientation, board members need to get training, right? Any important job requires that we keep fresh with our skills, fresh with new information that comes out. So ongoing training is critically important. IM82 does a nice job, I think, of addressing board training, so I encourage you to take a look at that. And that talks about board members need to be trained to carry out both their legal and fiduciary aspects of their service and their leadership responsibilities to help guide their agency towards success. So again, right from IM82, regular board training is critically important. Now, the standard is written in a way to give you as an agency ultimate flexibility in what that training entails. It could vary during the course of the year. This does not mean that every agency, once every 2 years, does a 3-hour training on duties and responsibilities. That's not what we're saying. Is that at some point you're going to need training. That could be perhaps prior to your audit, a refresher course. What does it mean to meet with your auditor? What does the audit tell you? How do you read the audit? What are the critical components? We have a number of toolkits that can help you train up your board to be ready for that auditor's visit. You might want to do a training before a strategic planning process. What does it mean to go through a strategic plan? Why is it important? What is the board's responsibility in that process? Or you might want to do that 3-hour basic board roles and responsibilities training on the duties of care, loyalty, and obedience. That's great too, but this is meant to give you flexibility on what that means. Board training can be done at board meetings. Some agencies kind of do a mini training at every board meeting. You could do them at special sessions. You could do them as part of conferences through electronic pieces. I know CAPLA has a lot of good videos up on board roles and responsibilities. They have a whole new product up on their website to help provide local consultants and local peers. You can actually download a whole training curriculum. You can do peer-to-peer training. You can provide it to a consultant in your community to help train your board as well. So check out, again, caplaw.org for some great board training resources. Now you can document that you did this, right, through sign-in sheets, copies of the curriculum, board minutes saying that the training was done. I think there's a lot of different ways to show that you've met the standard, but again, those are itemized in the TA guide. I do note here that, as with orientation, it's tough to make volunteers do anything. Mandated, I mean. You can get them to do a lot of different things, and we're critically reliant on volunteers, but again, if a board member chooses not to participate in that training, there's very little that an agency ED can do. Now, again, that board-to-board peer pressure, that board culture, I think is important. Although I have done board training where a certain sector of the board has been opted out of training, they don't need the training, I would argue that that doesn't help board culture, making sure that everyone embraces the need for training. So, again, I just like to add that caveat. We also know, and we talk about in the guide, that there's a lot of other outside opportunities for training. A lot of chambers of commerce, a lot of United Ways, other state associations of nonprofits do board training, all great resources for you to access. It doesn't have to be CAP specific. You also have national events like CAPLAW's conference, our conference. There are a number of ways that boards can get training, and I know many of you take advantage of a lot of those opportunities. All right, standard 5.9. Let me pause. Any questions have come in? No? All right, so standard 5.9. The governing board has received programmatic reports at each regular board meeting. Now, if you look at the financial standards, it'll say that the boards need to get financial reports at every board meeting, but the programmatic reports included in this area. But that's why it's important to look at all the different categories of standards to make sure you know everything that board members need to be paying attention to. But in Section 5, Category 5, we focus on programmatic reports. Good board process says that boards need to know programmatically what's going on in the organization. Now, this is why we talked earlier on about board committee structure a little bit. Having a program, like we talked about having a nominations, board governance, or board development committee can help you meet some of these standards. A program committee of the board, I think, is another way that helps boards meet these and a number of other standards. So, again, this standard is not meant to be complex, that an agency does not have to report on all programs at every board meeting. You can have agencies rotate programs throughout different board meetings throughout the year. Let's go to the next slide. So you could potentially have each board meeting, a different program director comes in and talks about 1 month it's Head Start, 1 month it's weatherization, another month it's family development, another month it might be emergency services. Although as many more organizations are going to bundled services and de-siloing, you don't really have individual programs, you have how do we serve a family. So I don't want to get stuck into the silos either, so I think there are a lot of different ways for agencies to be thinking about how you do programmatic reports to your board. Now, I think you could also here, if you look, the third bullet, you could also have dashboard reporting to the board. They could be done in writing. They could be done verbally. But I think it's important to note that a program committee of the board could really do the deep dive, touchstone with staff about what's going on with the programs. And as long as some level of report comes to the full board, I think that's important. So I think you can use program committees for the deep dive analysis of what's going on with programs, but the full board does need to be kept up to speed, up to date on what is going on with the programs agency-wide. Any questions coming on any of the individual standards? Great. Well, feel free to keep using that chat window if you have any thoughts or questions. So let's move on.
We do have one that's late breaking.
Okay.
Would sending training opportunities via email regularly to board members satisfy 5.8? We send them out monthly, but they don't check back on participation.
I would definitely check back on participation to find out, again, just to help you document that your board members are getting that information. Have been provided with training on their duties and responsibilities within the past 2 years. I wouldn't say that a simple email out of these opportunities. I think you need to provide these opportunities. I think providing, if you're going to be willing to pay for someone to go to the Cap-Law conference, for instance, to get board training, certainly that is an opportunity to get the training. But you're going to want to provide some level of training within your organization as well. So I would probably lean toward no, that would probably not meet, just sending out an email saying these trainings are available would not meet the standard. Good question, though. Okay. So let's go on to assessment. The TA guide that we've provided certainly does provide an agency scale to kind of go beyond compliance. It's designed really for agency use only, not for the state. Now, I say that because we were really clear, the CSBG working group was when we developed the standards to really say we really want to make sure that agencies know whether they met the standard or didn't meet the standard. But we've also been clear for a long time that we've been talking about a 5-point scale. We'd like to help agencies do an assessment internally to help them figure out, did we just miss the standard or did we really blow and tank on it? Or did we really exceed the standard, or did we really do an excellence model in terms of how we met the standard? So the CSBG working group took a stab at this, and again, this is meant to be internal use only. It's not meant to be shared necessarily with the state. It's meant to be, again, for agencies to figure out how they're doing along the continuum. So again, this is a copy. We have this in the toolkit. It's downloadable, usable, modifiable. You're not stuck with just our simple model, but it has each of the standards. It has the documentation that you use. Where did you fall along the continuum? The shaded column is the satisfactory or the met column, certainly, on how you did against the standard, what actions you want to take, who's responsible, and the target date. The next slide shows you a sample of what's in these scales, as it were. Again, this is just an example of what it might mean to exceed a particular organizational standard. There might be 100 different ways to document that you exceeded a particular organizational standard. So if we look at standard 5.1, for instance, the standard is your board structured in compliance with the CSBG Act? Do you have all three components, three sectors of the board seated? Yes, you do. You go to advancing, our low-income board seats are filled really by people living in low-income communities, and each committee of the board who has the decision-making ability for the board, i.e. the executive committee is probably really the only one, has the tripartite structure as well. And an outstanding organization may say, we're going to make sure all of our committees have a tripartite structure. And we're going to try to reflect that tripartite nature across all of our committees, which can be an incredibly challenging attempt. I know many agencies do work toward that, which I think is stellar. But again, it kind of gives you the continuum along. Now, going the other direction, unsatisfactory, our bylaws reference a tripartite structure perhaps, but our board does not reflect this. And unacceptable would be that our bylaws don't even talk about our tripartite structure, for instance. So we have a variety of these scales in the toolkit for you to take a look at. You can go to the next slide. Here we have standard 5.4 through 5.6, I want to say. And then we go the last three also up on the page, 5.7 to 5.8, 5.9. So you can see here that, again, we try to give you the continuum from really missing the standard all the way to exceeding the standard. And again, these aren't locked in stone. It's just because you're in one category or another. It's just where your agency sits. It's to try to give you a guide of ways to be thinking differently, perhaps, about the organizational standards. We've always said from day one that the organizational standards are not the excellent standards. We have certainly the the Community Action Standards of Excellence program and our Pathways to Excellence program, which have very high-level, Baldrige-level standards. The organizational standards were never meant to be that, right? They're meant to be good, basic business practices. But again, the toolkit is meant to help expand, perhaps, your thinking about what it might mean to meet the organizational standards. So, how to use the TA guide. I would download it. We'll be posting it probably within the next week or so. This presentation will be up tomorrow, but the toolkit I know is still in the last stages of formatting. It'll be up hopefully in the next week or two. Copy and modify the tools as you need them. Distribute them widely. Use them in conjunction with that self-assessment tool that we have up on our website. And again, access other resources, such as, and I don't mean to keep pushing it, but I will, the Top-Notch Toolkit. I was talking with Eleanor Evans from CapLaw, and we were talking about the variety of toolkits we have up online, both on our website and CapLaw's website and NASCA's website. And there are a tremendous amount of resources. It's tough for any agency to keep track of all the toolkits that are out there. So that's why our guide, we don't rewrite everything that's in their toolkit. We send you back to their toolkit. So we encourage you to download, read it, get familiar with these resources, and make them your own. So I will pause here to see if any other questions have come in. I see another question has come in.
We do. Would you say that attendance lists at board orientations and trainings would be required?
I think it would be helpful. I would say that an attendance list would help document that that training was provided. So I think that's a great way to document that orientation happened and that training happened. Should it be required? I think there might be other ways to say that orientation process was done or that training was provided. Nothing really beats a sign-in list, but I think there might be other ways. I don't think you should have to be kept to one particular way. Now, I will add the caveat, though, that agencies, states, and associations can determine in their individual states what it means to meet the standard. And if in your state, you've kind of come to a consensus that you're going to say that a sign-in sheet is going to be a way for you to document, more power to you, and I think that works at your individual state level. So I think you're going to have to figure out, and states are going to have to figure out what it means to provide that documentation.
We have another question in. They have been asked to, by their state, to complete and submit a self-assessment. Given all the caveats that you noted here, and this being for internal use, any feedback on how that would work?
Yep. I would hope that the state would prepare. I think doing an agency assessment for the state on the organizational standards is probably, many states have done that, which is great. Many states have used the standards assessment tool that was developed several months ago that's up on our website that is purely a met, not met scenario. That's what I would think would be an appropriate piece for the state to be using. I know there have been talks. I think it's up to individual states, agencies, and associations to figure that out. But again, that scale, for me, is much more of an agency TA, technical assistance tool. I think an agency assessment that says, did you meet or not meet the standard, very appropriate. So I see those as two different pieces. The tool in the toolkit would be for agencies. The tool in our initial toolkit, I guess as it were, would be an appropriate state agency assessment. Hope that answers the question from at least my perspective.
All right. We are good there.
All right.
So that is all the questions that have come in. We'll kind of dilly-dally a moment here to see if any late breaking come in. But we do have our team here at the partnership, all of those email addresses up on the screen now. So don't let this be the end of the conversation. Reach out to any of us if you have questions about the standards themselves, about any of the tools, any of the webinars, anything at all, do reach out to us. Denise also mentioned earlier a couple of other webinars, so if you are watching this in live time, you still have time to register. September 21st is one that I want to add particular notice about because it is on conflict of interest, one of the standards in the governance category. There are a couple of other webinars that are upcoming as well, ethics, whistleblower, so I think those do have some nice overlap with the standards. If you're watching this on the recording, then I encourage you to take a look at those recordings. Those will be recorded and slides available as well, so do look those up if you have questions in any of those categories. So I don't have any other questions, so any closing thoughts before you leave?
Again, feel free to reach out to us. Many of us are in the field frequently as well at state association or regional or other national conferences talking about standards, especially for governance. I encourage folks to access, if you can't find that series of YouTube videos that we did for board members on the standards. They're 5 to 10 minute long videos, snippets as it were, and we also have a 2-pager for board members that kind of explains what do they need to be paying attention to the standards. I encourage you to take a look at that because, again, Category 5 is the governance category, but there are standards all across the board that fit with board governance. And we're going to continue to develop toolkits and resources and trainings and webinars, so keep an eye at communityactionpartnership.com. Take a look specifically at our National Training Center. We'll also hopefully revamping our website to make it easier to navigate. But in the meantime, look at our National Training Center for webinars. We have all of ours posted once they're recorded and downloaded. So, any other questions have come in?
That's it. I did want to put one more plug for a useful resource. We also have a calendar of required actions.
Yep.
There are 2 different ones. There's one that covers all of the standards, and then there's one that is specifically for boards. It's about 2/3 or so of the standards have some sort of board involvement. So instead of reading those by category, we're reading them by time frame. So it breaks them out. Is this something you do every year, every 2 years, every 3 years, every 5 years, ongoing? And that would be a nice checklist item to make sure that all of your agendas, minutes, and all that are nice and organized and ready to go for the standards.
That's a great resource. All right, with that then, I guess we will sign off. Thank you so much for being on the webinar or listening to the recorded version. Let us know here at the partnership. Contact Gerald, Cash, and Natalie or myself if you have follow-up questions, and thank you so much for being part of this ongoing work. Good luck. We'll talk to you soon. Take care.